He never spoke about the war, never mentioned the medals gathering dust in his closet, never told anyone about the night he carried 3 wounded soldiers through enemy fire for 6 miles. He just fixed cars. Day after day, covered in grease, hands steady as stone. The young Marines at the auto shop thought he was just another old-timer who'd never seen real action. Until the day one of them noticed the faded scar running down his forearm and realized it matched perfectly with a legendary story they had heard in boot camp about a man who was supposed to be dead. Welcome to the human stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden courage and unexpected recognition, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These quiet heroes need their voices amplified. The shop sat on the edge of Riverside, California, wedged between a taco stand and a used tire lot. Martinez Auto Repair wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, oil stains older than most of the cars that rolled through, and a sign that had been crooked since 1987. But what it lacked in appearance, it made up for in reputation. If your engine was dead, Carlos Martinez could bring it back to life. Carlos had owned the place for 12 years, ever since he'd left the Corps. He was quiet, methodical, and never charged more than fair. The young Marines from nearby Camp Pendleton loved bringing their beat-up rides to him because he understood their budgets and never made them feel stupid for not knowing a carburetor from a transmission. Most days, Carlos worked alone, but 6 months ago, he'd hired help an older man named Frank, who'd answered a handwritten "Help Wanted" sign with nothing but a nod and a firm handshake. Frank was somewhere in his 60s, gray-haired, with hands that knew their way around an engine like they'd been born holding wrenches. Frank didn't talk much. He arrived every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, worked with the quiet precision of someone who'd spent decades making sure things were done right the first time, and left at 5 p.m. without fanfare. He wore the same thing every day: faded jeans, steel-toed boots, and a simple gray t-shirt that had seen better decades. The Marines who came in young, loud, full of energy and bravado, barely noticed him. To them, Frank was just the old guy in the corner who handed them parts and nodded when they cracked jokes about officers or complained about training. He smiled politely, kept working, and never joined their conversations about deployments or combat training. "Old school mechanic," they'd say. "Probably never left the county, but he sure knows his way around a transmission." Carlos knew better, but he never said anything. There was something about Frank that suggested depth, the way he moved with purpose, the way his eyes scanned every room he entered, the way he stayed calm when things went wrong. Carlos had seen enough Marines to recognize the signs, but Frank's past wasn't his business. One Tuesday morning, 3 young Marines rolled in driving a 1995 Honda Civic that sounded like it was dying a slow, painful death. Lance Corporals Rodriguez, Thompson, and Jackson had pooled their money to buy the car off Craigslist, and now they were starting to realize why it had been so cheap. "It's making this grinding noise," Rodriguez explained to Carlos, popping the hood. "Started yesterday, and now it won't even shift into 3rd gear." Carlos peered under the hood, listening to the engine knock and wheeze. "Transmission's shot," he said after a moment. "You're looking at $800 to rebuild it, maybe more." The 3 Marines exchanged glances. $800 might as well have been $8,000 on their salaries. "Any chance you could just patch it up?" Thompson asked hopefully. "Get us through another month or 2? Carlos shook his head. "I could try, but you'd be throwing good money after bad. This thing needs a complete rebuild or a replacement transmission." Frank, who'd been quietly organizing tools in the corner, looked up. He walked over to the car, listened to the engine for a moment, then crouched down and peered underneath. Without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and spent 5 minutes examining the undercarriage. Finally, he stood up and wiped his hands on a rag. "It's not the transmission," he said quietly. It's the clutchmaster cylinder. $40 part, 2 hours of labor. Carlos raised an eyebrow. Frank had been right about diagnoses before, but this seemed like a long shot. You sure? Frank nodded. Seen it 1,000 times. The grinding isn't coming from the gears. It's hydraulic pressure loss. The clutch isn't fully disengaging. 2 hours later, Frank had been proven right. The Honda was purring like a content cat, shifting smoothly through all 5 gears. The Marines were ecstatic. They had expected to be out $800 and instead owed less than $200 for parts and labor. Man, you're a wizard, Rodriguez said to Frank as they settled up. Where'd you learn to diagnose like that? Frank just shrugged. Experience. You work on cars in the military? Jackson asked. Among other things, Frank replied, already turning back to his workbench. But Rodriguez wasn't ready to let it go. He'd been curious about Frank for weeks. There was something about the old man that didn't quite fit the image of a small-town mechanic. What branch? Frank paused, his back still turned. Marines. No kidding? When did you serve? Long time ago, Thompson jumped in. My dad was a Marine, Vietnam era. You serve overseas. Another pause. Some. Rodriguez was about to ask another question when Carlos cleared his throat pointedly. Frank's got work to do, and so do you 3. Your car's ready. The Marines took the hint, but as they were leaving, Rodriguez noticed something. Frank was reaching for a tool on a high shelf, and his gray T-shirt rode up slightly, revealing a jagged scar along his lower back, the kind of scar that didn't come from working on cars. It was during the following week that everything changed. Rodriguez couldn't stop thinking about Frank. The old man's quiet competence, his mysterious answers, the scar it all pointed to something more than a simple mechanic's background. So that Thursday evening, Rodriguez did what any curious Marine would do. He started asking around. Hey, Gunny, he said to Gunnery Sergeant Williams after evening chow. You ever hear of a Marine named Frank? Older guy, probably served in the 80s or 90s. Williams looked up from his paperwork. Frank what? I don't know his last name. Works at Martinez Auto Repair downtown. Real quiet. Knows his stuff. Rodriguez, there's probably 1,000 Marines named Frank who served in the 80s and 90s. What's this about? Rodriguez explained about the car repair, Frank's diagnostic skills, and the sense that there was more to the story. Williams listened, then shrugged. Could be anybody. Why don't you just ask him? But Rodriguez had tried that approach. Frank wasn't the type to open up, especially not to a young lance corporal who barely knew which end of a wrench to hold. That's when Thompson had an idea. His uncle was a retired colonel who'd served for 30 years and had connections throughout the Corps. I'll ask Uncle Mike, Thompson said. He knows everybody who's anybody in Marine history. 3 days later, Thompson's phone rang. You said this guy works at Martinez Auto Repair? Colonel Thompson's voice was serious. Older man, gray hair, quiet. Yeah, Uncle Mike. You know him. There was a long pause. What's his last name? I don't know. He just goes by Frank. Another pause. Describe him. Height, build, any distinguishing features. Thompson described Frank as best he could, including the scar Rodriguez had noticed. When he finished, the line went quiet for almost a full minute. Finally, Colonel Thompson spoke, his voice lower than before. If that's who I think it is, you need to show that man some respect. Real respect. Who is he? I can't say for certain without seeing him myself, but if I'm right, that man is a goddamn legend. Colonel Thompson wouldn't say more over the phone, but he promised to drive down from Los Angeles that weekend. Don't mention this conversation to anyone, he warned, and don't treat him any differently until I can confirm. But Thompson, if I'm right about who this is, you've been in the presence of one of the finest Marines who ever lived. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, typical for Southern California in early November. Rodriguez, Thompson, and Jackson had arrived at the auto shop early, ostensibly to get Thompson's truck looked at for a minor oil leak, but really to wait for Colonel Thompson's arrival. Frank was already there, of course, methodically working on an engine rebuild. He nodded to the young Marines as they entered, but didn't look up from his work. At 10:30 a.m., an immaculate black Ford F-150 pulled into the lot. Colonel Thompson emerged wearing civilian clothes jeans and a polo shirt, but his bearing left no doubt about his military background. He walked with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command, his silver hair neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp and assessing. Carlos greeted him at the front desk. "Help you, sir?" "I'm looking for Frank," Colonel Thompson said. "My nephew said he works here." Carlos gestured toward the back of the shop. "He's working on the Chevy back there." Colonel Thompson walked slowly toward the rear of the garage, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Frank was bent over an engine block, his full attention focused on rebuilding a carburetor with the meticulous care of a surgeon. "Excuse me," Colonel Thompson said quietly. Frank looked up, and for a moment the two men just stared at each other. Something passed between them, recognition, surprise, and something deeper that the watching Marines couldn't identify. "Frank Henley," Colonel Thompson said, his voice filled with something between awe and disbelief. Frank slowly straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hello, Mike." "Jesus Christ, Frank, we thought you were dead." The garage had gone completely quiet. Carlos had stopped pretending to work on paperwork. The three young Marines stood frozen, realizing they were witnessing something significant. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Frank said with a slight smile, the first real smile any of them had ever seen from him. Colonel Thompson shook his head. "Do you have any idea how many Marines have been looking for you? How many times your name has come up in conversations about the greatest warriors this Corps has ever produced?" Frank looked uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm just fixing cars now, Mike." "Bullshit." Colonel Thompson's voice carried the authority of 3 decades of leadership. "Frank Henley doesn't just fix cars. Staff Sergeant Frank Henley, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. The man who single-handedly held off an entire enemy squad in Mogadishu while evacuating wounded civilians. The Marine who carried 3 wounded soldiers 6 miles through enemy territory in Afghanistan when their convoy was ambushed." The young Marines felt their jaws drop. Rodriguez remembered the story now. It was one of the legendary tales told in boot camp, though no one had ever mentioned names. Frank held up a hand. "That was a long time ago." "That was yesterday in Corps time," Colonel Thompson shot back. "Frank, do you realize that your actions in Somalia and Afghanistan are still taught at the Staff NCO Academy? That young Marines learn about your courage and selflessness as examples of what it means to be a Marine?" Frank looked around the garage, taking in the stunned faces of Carlos and the 3 lance corporals. "I just wanted to disappear for a while. Work with my hands. Be useful without anyone making a big deal about it." Colonel Thompson stepped closer. "Frank, you've been missing for 8 years. You left the Corps, disappeared completely. The Commandant himself signed off on an investigation to find you." "I needed time," Frank said quietly. "After the last deployment, I just needed time." Rodriguez found his voice. "Sir, we had no idea. I mean, we knew you were prior service, but..." Frank looked at the young Marine with tired eyes. "That's the point, son. I didn't want you to know. I wanted to just be Frank the mechanic, not Staff Sergeant Henley, not a war hero, just a guy who fixes cars and tries to forget." Thompson stepped forward. "But sir, you've been helping us all along, fixing our cars, teaching us about engines, being patient with our questions. You've been serving in a different way." Frank considered this for a moment. "Maybe. But it felt good to be useful without anyone expecting me to be a hero." Colonel Thompson's expression softened. "Frank, no one expects you to be anything other than what you are. But what you are is a Marine who exemplified everything this Corps stands for. And there are a lot of young Marines who could learn from your example, not just your combat record, but your humility, your work ethic, your dedication to helping others without asking for recognition. Frank was quiet for a long moment, looking around the garage that had been his sanctuary for 6 months. Finally, he spoke. "I appreciate what you're saying, Mike. I really do. But I'm not ready to go back to being Staff Sergeant Henley. I like being Frank the mechanic. I like fixing things instead of breaking them. I like helping these young Marines with their cars and watching them figure out how to be adults." Colonel Thompson nodded slowly. "I understand. But Frank, you don't have to choose between being a mechanic and being a Marine. You can be both." Frank looked at Rodriguez, Thompson, and Jackson, 3 young men who'd been joking around him for months without knowing they were in the presence of a living legend. "These boys treat me like a regular person," Frank said. "They ask me about carburetors, not combat. They worry about getting their cars fixed, not about living up to some heroic image. That's been healing." Rodriguez stepped forward. "Sir, if it's okay, we'd like to keep treating you like Frank the mechanic. But maybe you could tell us some stories sometime, not about combat, but about being a Marine, about what it really means." Frank looked at the young Lance Corporal for a long moment, then at his 2 friends, then at Carlos, who'd been quietly listening to the entire exchange. "Maybe," he said finally, "but only if you promise to keep calling me Frank." Colonel Thompson smiled. "Deal. But Frank, the Corps is going to want to honor you properly. There are awards that were never presented, recognition that was delayed because no one could find you." Frank shook his head. "I don't need awards, Mike. I've got everything I need right here. A job that matters, young Marines to look after, and a boss who doesn't care about my past as long as I show up on time and do good work." Carlos spoke up for the first time. "Frank, you'll always have a job here. And if any of these young Marines give you trouble, they'll answer to me." Frank laughed, a real, genuine laugh that none of them had heard before. "I appreciate that, Carlos. I really do." Colonel Thompson extended his hand. "Frank, it's been an honor serving with you, even briefly. And if you ever change your mind about coming back to active duty or working with young Marines in an official capacity, you know how to reach me." Frank shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mike, for understanding, for not making this a bigger deal than it needs to be." As Colonel Thompson prepared to leave, he turned to Rodriguez, Thompson, and Jackson. "You 3 have been learning from one of the finest Marines I've ever known. Don't waste that opportunity." After the colonel left, the garage remained quiet for several minutes. Frank went back to work on the carburetor, but his movements were different somehow, less guarded, more at peace. Finally, Rodriguez spoke up. "Frank? Yeah? Would you mind if we brought some of our buddies by sometime? Not to gawk or anything, just to learn about cars and maybe, I don't know, learn about being Marines?" Frank didn't look up from his work, but they could see him smile slightly. "As long as they don't expect war stories." "No war stories," Thompson promised. "Just car stories." "And maybe some stories about what it means to serve," Jackson added quietly. Frank paused in his work and looked at the 3 young Marines. "That I can do." From that day forward, Frank's sanctuary remained intact, but it became something more. Word spread quietly among the young Marines at Pendleton that there was an old-school staff sergeant working at Martinez Auto Repair who could teach them things they wouldn't learn in any classroom. They came not for stories of heroism, but for lessons in humility. They learned that strength wasn't always about proving yourself, that service could take many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a warrior could do was choose to be gentle. Frank continued to arrive at 6 a.m. and leave at 5 p.m. He continued to fix cars with quiet precision and help young Marines stretch their budgets. But now, occasionally, he'd share a story about leadership or resilience or the importance of taking care of your Marines. And every few weeks, Colonel Thompson would stop by, not as a superior officer, but as an old friend checking in on a brother who'd found his own way to continue serving. Frank never went back to active duty. He never accepted the award ceremony the Corps wanted to throw for him. He remained Frank the mechanic, working in a small garage on the edge of Riverside, California. But for the hundreds of young Marines who passed through Martinez Auto Repair over the years, Frank became something more valuable than a war hero. He became proof that true strength comes from choosing to serve others, even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. Sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who choose to fight different battles, the battle against pride, against the need for recognition, against the temptation to live in past glory. Frank Henley found his peace not in medals or ceremonies, but in the simple act of fixing what was broken and helping young Marines become the men they were meant to be. And that, perhaps, was the most heroic thing of all. So I ask you, have you ever encountered someone whose quiet strength taught you more than any speech or ceremony ever could? Someone who served without seeking recognition, who led by example rather than by words? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the Frank Henleys in your life, the quiet heroes who chose humility over glory, service over recognition. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that the most powerful stories are often the quietest ones. The stories of people who continue to serve long after the cameras stop rolling and the crowds go home. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet heroes who make our world better, one small act of service at a time. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, more than any speech or ceremony ever could, someone who served without seeking recognition, who led by example rather than by words. Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the Frank Henleys in your life, the quiet heroes who chose humility over glory, service over recognition. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that the most powerful stories are often the quietest ones. The stories of people who continue to serve long after the cameras stop rolling and the crowds go home. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet heroes who make our world better, one small act of service at a time. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places.